in all this talk about the telephone call, I'm going to be spending a lot of time actually going through piece by piece of what that telephone call is about. I don't want you to misunderstand that I'm talking about having a call that takes a day to actually conduct, or even an hour. What I'm talking about is a very 12-minute to 20-minute phone call at most. And I know you might even imagine that that sounds like a long time. But really, again, I want to bring you back to the understanding of how much a lead is worth and how much value there is in these phone calls. To not spend at least 12 minutes, up to 20 minutes, it's not really giving the attention that it deserves. So I just want to give you a little bit of an overview in terms of how long each of these acts take, so that gives you some context for, even though we're going to spend a lot of time in each act explaining it in great detail, it really happens in a very short amount of time. So the greeting that I'm going to discuss only should take between 1 to 2 minutes, really depending on how much information and how difficult it is to get it from them. Number two, the act two, the opening, the questions that I'm talking about really should take between 5 to 7 minutes. Not too long. Just that's enough time to really get at what most people's motivations are. Act three, which is closing, should take about 2 to 3 minutes. Again, depending on how many questions they have, it might take a little longer. Handling objections might take between 2 to 12 minutes, depending again how many objections they have and how long it takes to overcome them. So generally speaking, we're talking about a phone call that really is going to last between 10 and 25 minutes at most. And I think that we want to be careful that if we spend any longer than that, we might actually be conducting a consultation instead of inviting people to have a consultation. Now, moving forward, I want to talk a little bit about why we should have a sales process at all. You might think, well, I've been doing this okay. I've been managing, I've been answering questions, I've been dealing with phone calls appropriately for years now. Why fix it if it isn't broken? Well, the fact is we wouldn't even be having this training if an area couldn't be improved. So I'm going to suggest that you follow a process. Other important jobs always follow a process. The doctor, when he walks into the operating theater, you better believe that they're going to have a process that they're going to follow. They're not just going to walk into an operating theater and go, oh, what have I got here today? Let's wing it. The same thing with, for example, an airplane pilot. They're not going to actually approach taking an airplane off the ground without having a really clear pre-flight checklist and a real process that they follow every single time in order to maximize the safety of that flight. They have checklists for taking off, they have checklists for landing, they have checklists for everything in between. So what I want you to do is I want you to take the same level of seriousness and the same level of commitment to having this job done well, which is having a good sales process. Sales processes have many benefits. One of the things is that we're working together with people. Number one, we're not the only people who are going to be dealing with this information. We're getting information from the patient. That's great. But we're also going to be passing that information to different lines down the path. And what I mean by that is we're going to get information that we're going to need to pass on to the next person who's going to see that patient. Now, the information we collect, this is the beauty of this process, is that we're effectively conducting research every time we do a telephone call. If we collect the information and then can pass that information on to the next person who gets to see that patient when they come in, well, they're going to be at such a great advantage because they're able to use this information you've collected and conduct their consultation with much greater preparation. And so that information is critical, and that's why this process works so well. The other thing that it allows you to do is to have more confidence in your role. If you know exactly what you're doing and what every step is, and you know what you're going to do next every time, you're never going to be in a situation where you're wondering, well, what do I do with this situation? You know what's going to happen. You know what the next step is. So you end up with much more confidence in your role. One of the challenges I find that people have is that they feel like they have to know everything about their products in order to do a good job. The reality is that I can take somebody who maybe has some basic definitional knowledge of a product and get them on the phone within one day, having them actually outperform people who've been doing the same job for 5 years. And that's not an exaggeration. You don't need to know too much about your product in order to do a good job selling on the phone. And the reason for that is because you're asking the questions. You're not answering the questions. Now, this is not to say that the more you know about your product, the better and the more confident you're going to be over time. But I don't want you to think that product knowledge has to stand in your way of doing this job well. It improves over time, but as I said earlier, it becomes a detriment because the more you know, the more you say, the more you talk, the less you listen. So we want to be sure that we're following a process that not only balances that information, but also allows you to have confidence in your role, even when you don't have the information. You have much more control over the sales interaction. That's another benefit of having a process. What that means is that it doesn't matter what kind of patient it is or what questions they ask or what they throw at you. Because you know your roadmap, you have control over that interaction, which means that if things go sideways, if things go off process, which they tend to do 99% of the time, you know exactly when to come back to your steps. For example, what I'm doing right now, I'm talking to you. I'm not reading off a script. I'm not, of course, I have a process. I have a step-by-step plan that I'm going to follow. But it allows me to be spontaneous. It allows me to be real. It allows me to be human with you, as opposed to being robotic. The more I know about my process, the more creative I can be inside that process, if that makes sense. I know it's a little counterintuitive because when we talk about process, it sounds like we're talking about having everything follow a B, C step process, which suggests that we're going to be boring. That's absolutely not the case. What this is about having control and having the ability to chop and change based on the circumstances that arise. So I want you to have the same level of confidence in talking to your patients in the way that I'm talking to you. It effectively allows you to deal with a wide variety of people, objections, needs. Having a process allows you the opportunity to take in lots of different kinds of information and be able to manage it appropriately. Again, this shortens sales cycles. If you do everything on the phone call that you need to do, you can reduce the need to have follow-up calls. You can reduce the need to extend sales conversations beyond the amount of time that you naturally should spend. It allows you to reduce the amount of wasted time because you know exactly what you're going to be doing and you know what the next step is. It allows you to loosen up and have more fun, really. As I said, the more real you can be with somebody on the phone, the more you're laughing, the more likely there is actually going to be a commitment. If they're going to buy anything from you, they have to trust you first. If they're going to trust you, they have to like you. If they don't like you, we're nowhere. So having a process allows you to be who you are and not be some kind of representation of who a company or even a patient wants you to be, but truly be who you are and be able to express yourself within the context of that process. Because as long as you're following those steps, you can do almost pretty much whatever you want to do. And I find that the people who bring the most of themselves, the most of their personality to the sales interaction, it creates that rapport, that genuine authenticity that's required for people to truly form a relationship with you. That will help the patient relax. That will help them ease their tension because they know they're dealing with a real person, somebody that they can get along with potentially. Again, let's not mistake that as being the patient's friend. We can be friendly without necessarily becoming friends. But I think it very much is much more enjoyable to have conversations of this nature, where you're talking about motivations and interests and desires, psychology, as opposed to having conversations that are all fact-based. You'll have a better time. Your days will flash in front of your eyes as if they're happening in minutes instead of hours. You're going to have a much, much more enjoyable job as a result of doing this process in the way that I instruct. Lastly, this process allows you to fix what's broken. So, for example, if we are doing things in a recipe-oriented manner, and if we leave out an ingredient, well, we know that the dish won't turn out as well if we had put that ingredient in. If we just go to the cupboard and throw a bunch of stuff in a pot, it might turn out tasting great, but it's very, very difficult to reproduce that dish unless we specifically wrote down what we put in and how much of that we put in. So having a process allows us to improve because it allows us to document specifically what it is that we're going to do, identify what we're not doing, and add more of those things in should we need to, or take some of them out. So it allows us to fix what's broken. Overall, all of these benefits result in the overall benefit that we're all really here to do, which is increase your conversion rate, which is to increase the number of patients who call and become appointments. That's what this is really about. But that really mainly serves the business and partially you. I'd like you to also enjoy this. I'd like you to engage in this process so that you can be more productive. Because generally speaking, I believe that people enjoy doing a good job. People want to do very, very well. And if you're better at your job, you're going to be happier doing it. You're going to do it for longer, and you're going to be better rewarded. Not just financially, but intrinsically, which is really what it's at the end all about.